Jake Morrison stood at the wide window of his ship and watched Earth grow smaller. The blue planet that had been home to humans for thousands of years was now just a dot among the stars. His hands pressed against the cold glass as another transport ship appeared beside them, filled with families who had packed their entire lives into metal boxes. The evacuation order had come 6 months ago from the Galactic Council. Every human colony, every human world, every human settlement had to be abandoned. The council said it was about resources and better organization. Everyone knew the real reason. The council wanted humans gone from the good parts of the galaxy. Amy Sullivan worked at her control station behind Jake. She had been counting ships all morning. "Another transport just left the planet," she said quietly. "That makes 300 ships this week." Jake nodded but did not turn around. Across all of human space, the same thing was happening. Mothers were packing clothes for their children. Fathers were loading tools they had used for years. Grandparents were taking one last look at gardens they had grown with their own hands. Then they walked onto ships and left their homes forever. What surprised everyone, even the council, was how quietly it happened. No one fought. No one refused to leave. No one even complained very loudly. Humans simply did what they were told and began the largest peaceful move in the history of the galaxy. Lisa Hayes was the governor of New Dallas, one of the biggest human colonies. When the council ships arrived in her system, she did not argue or make speeches. She sent out the schedules for evacuation and started organizing everything. The news reporters from other worlds praised her for being smart and cooperative, but those reporters did not see the private message she sent to every human world just before she went on camera. The message was short and used words that seemed harmless. "Remember the wheat," was all it said. Dr. Peter Collins understood immediately. He was the chief scientist for all human farming projects. For 50 years, Earth and human colonies had grown food for half the galaxy. Human farmers had discovered new ways to grow crops that fed billions of aliens across thousands of worlds. The council had grown fat and happy eating human food. Now all that knowledge was walking away. In his research center on New Terra, Dr. Collins watched his assistants carefully delete files from their computers. They were not destroying everything in anger. They were quietly removing the most important information about how to grow food. The genetic codes for the best crops disappeared. The instructions for making soil healthy vanished. The schedules for when to plant different seeds were erased. All of this information was copied onto special drives that would travel with the humans to their new homes. But the aliens who would try to keep growing food after humans left would not have access to any of it. Meanwhile, on farms across council space, human workers finished their last harvests. They said polite goodbyes to their alien supervisors and left behind instruction manuals for the new workers who would replace them. Of course, those instruction manuals were missing some very important details, the kind of knowledge that came from years of experience, the small tricks that made the difference between growing enough food and growing barely any food at all. The council officials barely noticed these missing details. After all, farming was simple work that anyone could do. How hard could it be to put seeds in dirt and water them? On the farming world of Ceres Station, an alien supervisor named Keltrak read through the instruction manual left by the human farm manager. The manual explained when to plant corn and how much water to use. It told him which chemicals would help the plants grow better. Everything seemed very clear and simple. What the manual did not explain was why the human always walked through the fields every morning before dawn. It did not mention that he checked the color of the leaves to know if the plants were healthy. It did not describe how he could tell by the smell of the soil whether it needed different nutrients. These were things the human had learned from his father, who had learned from his father going back many generations. Keltrak was confident he could figure out these small details as he went along. The important information was all written down in the manual. Dr. Collins finished uploading the last of the agricultural databases onto his personal ship. 50 years of research and development were now stored in quantum drives that would travel with the human fleet. The aliens could try to recreate this knowledge, but it would take them decades to learn what humans already knew. He walked through his empty laboratory one last time. The equipment was still there, but without the humans who knew how to use it properly, most of it would be worthless. The council had focused on taking human territory, but they had not thought about taking human expertise. Jake Morrison received a message from Fleet Command as his ship moved away from Earth. "Admiral, Barnes wanted all transport captains to report to the Kepler Nebula. Most aliens thought the nebula was worthless because of dangerous gravity fields and radiation storms. What they did not know was that humans had been secretly mapping safe routes through the nebula for 20 years. The Kepler Nebula would become the new human home. It was far from Council space and protected by natural barriers that would make invasion almost impossible. More importantly, it contained everything humans needed to build a new civilization that did not depend on anyone else. Amy Sullivan looked up from her instruments. "Sir, we just received coordinates for our new settlement. Looks like we will be farming again, just in a different place." Jake smiled for the first time in months. "Good. We will show the galaxy what humans can really do when we are free to do it our way." Behind them, Earth continued to shrink until it was just another star. But the humans were not looking backward anymore. They were looking ahead to a future where they would never again have to ask permission to exist. The Council thought they had solved their human problem by forcing an evacuation. They believed they had taught humans their proper place in the galaxy. What they had actually done was free humanity from dependence on alien approval and alien systems. The humans went quietly because they knew something the Council did not understand. Real power did not come from making noise or fighting battles. Real power came from being the people everyone else needed but took for granted. Soon the Council would learn this lesson. But by then it would be too late to fix their mistake. Rachel Stone stood in the command center of her ship and read the reports coming from across the galaxy. 6 months had passed since the last human transport left Council space. The humans were now settled in the Kepler Nebula, building new homes and new farms. But the real news was coming from the worlds they had left behind. On Velthera Prime, the grain harvest was 30% smaller than usual. The alien farmers had followed all the instructions left by the humans, but something was wrong. The crops grew slowly and many plants died before producing any grain. The Veltharan administrators sent urgent requests to their government asking for help. On Corvani Station, the situation was even worse. The huge hydroponic systems that fed millions of people were producing bitter, terrible food that no one could eat. The station managers had tried everything they could think of, but the plants kept getting sick and dying. For the first time in decades, Corvani Station had to import food from other worlds. Ben Murphy, Rachel's assistant, brought her more reports every hour. "The milk production on Thessia Colony has dropped 80%, he said. "Their supervisors are asking if we can send human experts to help them." Rachel almost smiled. "Send them our standard response. We are very sorry, but all our experts are busy building our new settlements. Maybe in a few years when we are more settled, we can discuss helping them." The response was polite and apologetic, but the message was clear. The humans were not coming back to fix the problems they had not created. In the hidden shipyards of the Kepler Nebula, Dr. Kevin Ross supervised the construction of something the galaxy had never seen before. The humans were not building weapons or warships. Instead, they were building agricultural vessels, giant ships that were complete farms flying through space. These ships could grow enough food to feed entire colonies without needing anything from the outside. Each agricultural vessel was designed to be completely independent. They had their own soil systems, their own water recycling, their own power generation, and their own seed banks. A single ship could feed 50,000 people forever, no matter where they traveled in the galaxy. The Council had exiled humans to teach them that they needed the galactic community to survive. Instead, the humans were learning that they did not need anyone else at all. On Nexus Prime, the capital of the Galactic Council, Chairman Vextar read the agricultural reports with growing annoyance. The proud Valdari leader had been sure that inferior species would struggle without human oversight, but he had expected them to adapt quickly. Instead, the problem seemed to be getting worse every month. His solution was typically simple. If the farms were not producing enough food, the farmers needed to work harder. He increased production quotas and sent enforcement teams to make sure the requirements were met. Any world that failed to deliver enough food would face penalties and reduced resource allocations. The results were catastrophic. Forced to meet impossible demands, alien farmers pushed their crops beyond what the land could support. They used too much fertilizer, planted too often, and harvested before the crops were ready. The soil became exhausted and poisoned. Carefully balanced ecosystems that had taken centuries to develop collapsed in a matter of months. Within a year of Chairman Vextar's new policies, Half the agricultural worlds in Council space were reporting critical shortages. Some worlds could barely feed their own populations, let alone export food to other colonies. Dr. Ross watched these developments with careful interest from his flagship, the Pioneer. As the former head of the Interspecies Agricultural Consortium, he had spent 30 years building the very systems that were now failing without human knowledge and human care. He decided to reach out to his former colleagues in the Council. Ross composed a message offering humanitarian aid and agricultural assistance to any world that needed help. The tone was respectful and concerned, like a neighbor offering to help after a natural disaster. The conditions for this help were very simple. The Council would need to formally recognize that humans were an independent, sovereign people in the Kepler Nebula. They would also need to acknowledge that the relocation had been voluntary, not forced. Finally, they would need to apologize for any misunderstandings that had led to the unnecessary evacuation. Guasiu sent the message through official diplomatic channels and waited for a response. Chairman Vextar's reply came within hours and was exactly what Ross had expected. The Council rejected the offer completely. They would solve their agricultural problems without crawling to the inferior humans for help. The Valdari chairman made it clear that accepting human aid would be seen as a sign of weakness that the Council could not afford. Ross deleted the message with satisfaction. He had made the offer in good faith, knowing it would be refused. Now humanity could proceed with their plans without any guilt about refusing to help former neighbors. The agricultural crisis continued to spread across Council space. Worlds that had been rich and prosperous for generations were now struggling to feed their populations. Trade routes that had carried food for centuries were empty because there was no food to transport. On Zerion 4, the primary food processing facility shut down completely. The Zerioni technicians could not figure out how to operate the complex machines that humans had designed and built. Similar failures happened across the galaxy as species after species discovered that their prosperity had been built on human knowledge they did not possess. Maria Lopez sat in the diplomatic gallery on Nexus Prime and watched emergency session after emergency session of the Council. As the last human representative in Council space, she had requested permission to stay behind to maintain diplomatic relations. In reality, she was there to witness what her species had accomplished. Every day, she sent encrypted reports back to human space describing the growing chaos. The numbers were staggering. Agricultural output across the entire Council had dropped by 60%. Famine threatened dozens of core worlds. The Council's reputation for efficiency and competence was crumbling as their dependence on human expertise became impossible to ignore. Most ironic part was that the Council had exiled humans to prove their own superiority. Instead, they had proven that their entire civilization depended on the quiet competence of the species they had considered inferior. Maria watched Council members argue and blame each other for the crisis, but none of them would admit the obvious truth. Without humans, the galactic community was slowly starving to death. 2 years had passed since the humans left Council space, and Maria Lopez could see the fear in every alien face around her. As the only human still living on Nexus Prime, she had a front-row seat to watch the mighty Galactic Council slowly fall apart. Every day brought new emergency meetings and new reports of failing worlds across their empire. The numbers were getting worse each month. Agricultural output had dropped by 60% across all Council territories. What had started as minor crop failures was now a full disaster that threatened the survival of entire civilizations. Dozens of core worlds were facing real starvation for the first time in their history. Maria sent daily reports to the human government through quantum-encrypted channels that the Council could not intercept. The leadership back in Kepler Nebula needed to know exactly how bad things were getting in their former home. More importantly, they needed to know when the Council would finally be desperate enough to ask for help. On the agricultural world of Zerion 4, the main food processing center had been shut down for 3 months. The Zerioni engineers had tried everything they could think of, but they simply could not figure out how to operate the complex machines that human technicians had designed and maintained for decades. Without those machines, millions of tons of raw crops were rotting in storage facilities across the planet. Similar disasters were happening throughout Council space as alien species discovered that their technological civilization had been built on a foundation of human knowledge that they did not understand. The humans had not just grown food and fixed machines. They had been the invisible backbone that held everything together. Sam Carter commanded one of the new agricultural vessels operating in human space. His ship, the New Harvest, was a miracle of engineering that could grow enough food to feed 100,000 people while traveling between the stars. Every day, he received reports about the agricultural disasters spreading across Council territory, and every day he felt more grateful that humanity had been forced to become independent. The irony was not lost on him. The Council had exiled humans to teach them their proper place in the galaxy. Instead, they had freed humanity from dependence on alien governments and alien approval. While the Council starved, humans were learning to thrive in the deepest parts of space. Paula Davis, his chief engineer, brought him another message from outside human space. "Sir, the Altair Syndicate is requesting immediate agricultural assistance. They are offering significant trade concessions and technology transfers in exchange for our help." Carter read through the proposal carefully. The Altair Syndicate had been one of the loudest voices supporting human relocation 2 years ago. Their representatives had argued that human expansion was a threat to non-human civilizations and that humans needed to be contained in less desirable parts of the galaxy. Now they were facing mass starvation on their industrial colonies and begging for the help they had once rejected. Send them our standard response, Carter decided. We are very sorry to hear about their difficulties, but all our agricultural resources are committed to establishing sustainable communities in our new territory. Perhaps in a few years, when our own settlements are more secure, we might be able to discuss some form of limited assistance. The language was diplomatic and apologetic, but the message was unmistakable. The species that had cheered for human exile would have to solve their own problems. Actions had consequences, and those consequences were now coming due. Back on Nexus Prime, Chairman Vextar faced the most serious challenge to his authority in 50 years. Council member Zarath of the Procyon Federation had formally called for his removal from office, citing catastrophic mismanagement of galactic resources. The charges were officially about administrative incompetence, but everyone in the chamber understood what was really being discussed. The human problem had become too big to ignore. Maria Lopez watched the proceedings. From the diplomatic gallery with professional interest and personal satisfaction, the Council's famous unity was cracking as each member species began to prioritize their own survival over collective ideology. Several smaller governments were quietly reaching out to human representatives, hoping to negotiate separate agreements for agricultural assistance. The human diplomats took these meetings and listened politely to every proposal. They expressed deep sympathy for the Council's difficulties and genuine concern for the suffering of innocent civilians. But no agreements were signed and no aid was promised. The price for human assistance had not yet been met. That price was simple but non-negotiable. The Council would need to formally apologize for forcing the human evacuation and recognize the complete sovereignty of human space. Until that happened, humanity would continue to build their own civilization while the galactic community learned to survive without them. The breaking point came when 3 more agricultural worlds declared states of emergency in the same week. Ryloth Prime, Andoria Station, and New Corinth all reported that their food production had collapsed to the point where they could not feed their own populations. Riots were breaking out on industrial worlds as workers abandoned their jobs to search for food. Some alien governments were now actively encouraging their citizens to emigrate to human space if they could find a way to get there. The species that had once considered humans inferior were now viewing human territory as the only safe haven in an increasingly dangerous galaxy. Tony Mitchell received these emigration requests at his office in the Human Immigration Center. As Director of External Population Affairs, he was responsible for processing requests from non-humans who wanted to live in human space. The applications were reviewed carefully and most were approved, but only under strict conditions. Anyone who wanted to live in human territory would need to acknowledge human authority and accept human law. They would need to contribute useful skills to human society and demonstrate genuine respect for human culture and values. Most importantly, they would need to publicly state that the human evacuation had been unjust and that the Council had been wrong to force it. These statements were recorded and broadcast throughout the galaxy. Every day, More aliens appeared on news feeds praising human fairness and condemning the Council's treatment of humanity. The moral authority that the Council had claimed for 3,000 years was rapidly shifting to the species they had tried to exile. Chairman Vextar watched his empire crumble and still refused to admit that he had made a mistake. Pride had always been the weakness of his species, and that pride was now destroying everything they had built. Maria Lopez filed her daily report with growing anticipation. The end was coming soon. Year 3 brought complete collapse to the Council's core worlds. What had started as food shortages had grown into total system failure across half the galaxy. Without reliable agriculture, industrial workers left their jobs to search for something to eat. Without industrial production, the complex trade networks that had connected thousands of worlds for centuries simply stopped working. Admiral John Barnes commanded the human deep space fleet from his flagship, the Constellation. His ships patrolled the edges of human territory not to threaten anyone, but to make sure that desperate Council forces did not try to steal food from human settlements. So far, the Council had maintained the pretense that this was just an internal economic problem, not a crisis caused by the absence of human expertise. That pretense ended when the Corvani Mining Consortium sent warships to attack a human farming station in the Tau Ceti system. The human defenders did not fire back or try to fight. Instead, they activated their defensive shields and broadcast a message on every communication frequency in the galaxy. This is sovereign human territory under the protection of the Human Alliance. Any acts of aggression against human civilians or human property will be considered a declaration of war against all humanity. We strongly advise immediate withdrawal. The mining ships retreated without firing a shot, but the damage to the Council's reputation was complete. The entire galaxy now knew that the mighty Galactic Council was so desperate for food that they were willing to attack neutral farming settlements. On Nexus Prime, Chairman Vextar's government was falling apart. Street protests had erupted on dozens of worlds as hungry civilians demanded action to end the famine. The Council's military forces were stretched thin trying to maintain order, while also preventing refugee ships from fleeing to human space, because that was the final humiliation. Other species were now seeking refuge with the humans they had once considered inferior. The Centauri Republic had formally requested permission to establish colonies in human territory. The Rigel Confederation was negotiating for agricultural training programs. Even some of the Council's founding members were quietly exploring their options for joining the Human Alliance. Dr. Catherine Walsh served as Humanity's Minister of External Affairs from her office in New Geneva, the human capital in the Kepler Nebula. Every day brought new requests for assistance, new applications for refuge, and new offers of alliance from alien governments. Her responses were always the same, delivered with careful diplomatic precision. Humanity would be happy to discuss mutual cooperation and beneficial relationships with any government that formally recognized human sovereignty and issued a public apology for the forced relocation. The word apology was crucial. The Council could accept economic arrangements and even territorial concessions, but a formal apology would require them to admit they had been wrong about humanity's importance to galactic civilization. For proud species that had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years, such an admission was unthinkable, so the crisis continued to deepen. Production facilities shut down across Council space as workers abandoned their posts to search for food. Entire planets were evacuated when their life support systems failed, without human maintenance and human expertise. The grand civilization that had seemed eternal was proving to be as fragile as a structure built from paper. On the industrial world of Mechanicus Prime, the massive factory complexes that had produced starships for half the galaxy went dark. The alien engineers had tried to keep production running, but the manufacturing processes were too complex without the human supervisors who had designed and refined them over decades. Orders for new ships went unfilled while existing. Vessels broke down without proper maintenance. The Mechanicus government sent urgent requests to human space offering incredible sums of money for technical assistance. They were willing to pay any price for human engineers to return and restart their factories. The human response was polite but firm. All human technical experts were committed to building infrastructure in their new territory. Perhaps in the future, when human settlements were fully established, some form of cooperation might be possible. Meanwhile, in the deepest parts of the Kepler Nebula, humanity was constructing something unprecedented in galactic history. Entire worlds were being transformed into self-sufficient paradises that needed nothing from the outside universe. Advanced technology combined with human ingenuity had created agricultural and industrial systems that could sustain billions of people indefinitely. The humans were not just surviving in exile. They were thriving in ways that had never been possible under council oversight and council regulations. Free to innovate without alien bureaucracy, human science and human engineering had advanced more in 3 years than in the previous 30. Lisa Hayes, now serving as president of the New Texas colony, received daily reports about conditions in her former territory. The world she had once governed was now a wasteland where desperate survivors fought over scraps of food. The efficient, prosperous society that had existed under human management had collapsed completely. She felt no satisfaction in the suffering of innocent people, but she also felt no guilt about refusing to return. The council had made their choice when they decided that humans were disposable. Now they were learning the consequences of that decision. The breaking point came when Chairman Vextar's own home, World of Valdara, declared independence from the council rather than continue following his failed policies. The Valdari people were starving while their leader refused to admit his mistakes or ask for help from the humans who could save them. Council member Zarath of the Procyon Federation finally gathered enough support to force a vote of no confidence. The session was broadcast across the galaxy as representatives from dozens of species stood up to condemn Vextar's leadership and demand immediate action to end the crisis. But even with Vextar gone, the new council leadership faced the same impossible choice. They could maintain their pride and watch their civilization die, or they could swallow that pride and beg forgiveness from the species they had wronged. Maria Lopez watched these developments from her diplomatic post with growing anticipation. After 3 years of patient observation, she could finally see the end approaching. The council would soon have no choice but to surrender completely or face the total destruction of everything they had built. The humans had gone quietly when ordered to leave. Now they waited quietly for the invitation to return. But when that invitation came, it would be on human terms, establishing human authority over the galaxy that had tried to discard them. The quiet revolution was almost complete. The end came not with explosions or battles, but with a simple message broadcast across every communication channel in the galaxy. The new council chairman, a humble Centauri named Jorek who had replaced the disgraced Vextar, appeared on screens throughout known space looking, exhausted and defeated. The Galactic Council formally recognizes the complete sovereignty and independence of the human alliance, he said in a voice that shook with emotion. We express our deepest regret and sincere apology for the grave injustice of forcing human populations to relocate from their rightful homes. We humbly request immediate humanitarian assistance and the restoration of beneficial relationships between our peoples. The word apology echoed across the galaxy like thunder. After 3 years of pride and stubborn refusal, the council had finally admitted what everyone already knew. They had been wrong about humanity, wrong about their own capabilities, and wrong to believe they could survive without human knowledge and human cooperation. President Ellen Foster stood in the council chambers of New Geneva and watched the message with her senior advisors. As the elected leader of the Human Alliance, she had been waiting for this moment since the day the evacuation began. Her response was carefully prepared and delivered with the dignity that humanity had maintained throughout their exile. The Human Alliance accepts the council's statement and acknowledges their request for assistance, she said. Effective immediately, human relief operations will begin deployment to the most critical emergency zones. We look forward to rebuilding the relationships that should never have been broken. Within hours, human relief ships launched from bases throughout the Kepler Nebula. The vessels that had been built as agricultural colonies were quickly converted into mobile aid stations carrying food, medical supplies, and technical expertise to worlds that were dying without them. But the terms of this assistance were clear and non-negotiable. Human aid would come with human oversight. Agricultural programs would be supervised by human experts according to human methods. Industrial facilities would operate under human management following human safety protocols. The species that had once considered themselves superior to humanity would now work under human guidance. Commander Tony Mitchell led the relief effort to Thessia Colony, one of the worlds that had suffered the worst agricultural collapse. When his ships arrived in the system, they found Deltan administrators waiting at the spaceport with desperate gratitude. These were the same officials who had celebrated human departure 3 years earlier, but now they hung on his every word and implemented his suggestions with frantic dedication. "The transformation is remarkable," Mitchell confided to his staff later that day. "They exiled us to prove their superiority, but instead they proved that we were indispensable." The change happened with stunning speed across Council space. Within 6 months, agricultural production began recovering on worlds that had been supervised by human experts. Industrial facilities reopened with human engineers and human quality control. The complex interstellar economy that had nearly collapsed was rebuilt with humanity at its center, not its periphery. But this was not the old relationship where humans had been junior partners grateful for inclusion in galactic society. Now humanity was the essential partner, the species without whom the galaxy simply could not function. Their quiet competence had become quiet dominance over every aspect of galactic civilization. Dr. Kevin Ross established his new headquarters on Nexus Prime itself, taking over the Agricultural Administration building that had once housed the bureaucrats who had overseen human relocation. The symbolism was unmistakable to everyone who saw it. Humans were no longer guests in the galactic community. They had become the foundation upon which everything else was built. The Council still existed and still made ceremonial decisions about trade routes and diplomatic protocols. But everyone understood the new reality. When humanity suggested policy changes, those changes became law within days. When humanity expressed concern about resource allocation, resources were immediately redistributed. When humanity was displeased with any government's behavior, that government quickly changed its approach. The humans had achieved what no military conquest could have accomplished. They now held complete, unquestioned authority over galactic civilization, not through fear or force, but through absolute necessity. Every world, every station, every colony depended on human knowledge and human goodwill for their survival. On the rebuilt farms of Velthara Prime, alien workers followed detailed instructions provided by human agricultural advisors. The crops were growing again, healthier and more abundant than they had been even before the crisis. But everyone knew that this prosperity existed only as long as the humans chose to maintain it. Senator Maria Lopez finally returned to human space after 3 years of diplomatic service on Nexus Prime. Her final report to the Human Alliance government captured the complete transformation that had taken place. Across the galaxy, we left quietly, because we knew something the Council did not understand, she wrote. Real power does not come from making threats or fighting wars. It comes from being irreplaceable. We gave the galaxy a simple choice between prosperity with human partnership and poverty without it. They chose poorly once, gambling that they could maintain their civilization without human contributions. They will never make that mistake again. The Human Alliance had not conquered the galaxy through violence or aggression. They had simply demonstrated that galactic civilization could not exist without them. The Council that had believed themselves untouchable had learned that their entire empire rested on the goodwill and cooperation of the species they had tried to discard. It was perhaps the most human victory possible. The galaxy remained free, diverse, and prosperous. Countless species continued to govern their own worlds and pursue their own destinies. The difference was that everyone now understood the truth that had always existed, but had been forgotten. Humanity was not just another species among many. They were the species that made everything else possible. Their knowledge, their skills, their innovations, and their quiet dedication held the entire galactic community together. Without them, the grand civilization that had lasted for millennia would crumble within years. The quiet revolution was complete. The people who had gone quietly into exile had returned as the galaxy's indispensable guardians. The species that had been dismissed as inferior had proven themselves to be absolutely essential. And everyone in the galaxy understood this new reality perfectly. The humans had won not through conquest, but through competence, not through force, but through necessity. They had achieved total victory by simply being themselves and letting others learn the consequences of their absence. The galaxy was still home to countless civilizations and endless possibilities. It just happened to depend entirely on humanity for its continued existence.